and introduce our first speaker today, Professor Stephen Williams. It's a great pleasure and privilege to introduce Stephen to you. He has been Professor of Systematic Theology at Union Theological College in Belfast since 1994. He studied modern history at Oxford, theology at Cambridge, and gained his doctorate at Yale. And he has focused on a whole range of areas in systematic theology, and more recently has been writing a commentary on Romans with Howard Marshall. So he's been very concerned, particularly with religious epistemology, and I think that will bring us more to where we're going to be today with this talk on science, faith, and reason. And I think I'll hand over straight to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. I, for one, am glad to be away from the pressure of microphones and radios and so forth and do things in a slightly more relaxed way this morning. I say relaxed, however, these spectacles are for long-distance viewing. It's when I want to see you in all your beauty I put these on. I normally would want this raised a bit higher because what I have in front of me is exactly what you have in front of you. Do you have the handouts for today? Except there is also, I also have handwritten, Donald will prove this, handwritten comments on my script. Definitely. Which are hard enough for me to read at the best of times, and at this distance, almost impossibly difficult. So occasionally, I know you're only here because of my elegance, but occasionally I'll inelegantly have to lean right forward like that or pick this up. Do you mind that? No, thank you very much. Okay, I'm simply going to go through the points on the sheet here, and I just have very few images. Science, faith, and reason. In thinking about this this morning before breakfast, I mean, I had given it some thought before this morning, I hasten to say, but in thinking before breakfast, I thought to myself, I perhaps have concentrated a little too much on faith and reason at the expense of science. So as I go along, I expect, as a matter of fact, I might adjust or expand certain things in this presentation so that science is taken care of duly. Although, of course, in any case, I'm addressing the whole question of science, faith and reason. It's a question of getting the balance right. I just want to begin point one with remarking on the popular perceptions, which will be familiar to all of us, about how things go as far as science, faith and reason are concerned. Science and reason are contrasted, I think, in much popular thinking, with faith and religion. Scientific reason is a species of reason. It's a way of reasoning. In fact, it's the paradigmatic way of reasoning for many people. If you want an example of reason in operation, science seems to provide that. Faith and religion belong, on the other hand, to a different domain. And that is the way I think the issue is set up popularly, not just simply popularly, set up in many minds. Faith on this side, science and reason on the other. And I certainly want to undermine that whole way of thinking. Secondly, you might already have concluded from the introduction that if I teach something called systematic theology, I'm not likely to be living in modern times, still less in postmodern times. In terms of postmodernity, does it not seem all wrong to talk about science and reason on the one hand and faith on the other? But as a matter of fact, although postmodern thinking may indeed not like that classification, that categorization, reason and science versus faith, that seems not to have filtered through in a great amount of public consciousness. Think, for example, of public political rhetoric. We're told that in postmodernity, you can't talk about some sort of absolute or rational absolute or morality per se. It is relative. But how many politicians ever talk like that? How many politicians ever say that it's okay to have poverty or torture or something of that kind? The political rhetoric is such that we do seem to be trading still in certain moral absolutes. That's the way it goes, whatever postmoderns say about it. And the same seems to me to be true with the public perception of science. Now, I stand corrected here. And I'd be most interested to know, from those of you who are scientists, as I'm not, what perceptions are in the scientific community, if we can talk of the scientific community at all. But certainly in terms of public perceptions, whatever you say about postmodernity, it seems that there are certain scientific truths, which are rational truths. And the debate goes on, science versus reason, versus faith, reason versus faith. I do not see the impact of postmodernity on those debates very, very strongly in the public square. But of course, one sees only in part, and I should be glad to be corrected if you think I'm mistaken on that point. Thirdly, one way in which I think many people tell the story, loosely speaking, the way they think things go. 3ABC. Firstly, what you have in the beginning, in earlier times, is religion and the primitive worldviews associated with religion. And let's pick out three things here: language, causality, and God. There is religious language, which, unbeknown to many of the people who use it, is mythological language, as a matter of fact. It does not trade in empirical actualities. It trades more in myths, although sometimes they're taken to be empirical actualities. In this more primitive mindset, causes are explicable in terms of divine action, or sometimes demonic action, but God did X, or the devil did X. That is the way the primitive religious mind works. And God is, of course, at the heart of all that. Now, however, 3b, things have changed. It's been the case for some time, but religious folk are long time catching up with it. In fact, we are still trapped in religion, which is effectively superstition. It's exposed as superstition when a scientific worldview comes along. With scientific enlightenment, it all changes. Language becomes used in a more measurable and precise way to talk about realities. Causality is explicable in terms of what we see or infer from what we see around us, empirical cause and effect. There's no need to invoke God at all to explain causes. And as for God, well, do we need God anymore, therefore? If God is not a causal force, what role does God have in discourse, in belief at all? So God becomes robbed of his role. And so when it's put all together, this is, I think, a set of assumptions floating around. When it's all put together, what you have, 3C, is reason, science, and Western secular democracy, because democracy is contrasted to hierarchy. It smacks of modernity as opposed to antiquity. It smacks of reason as opposed to dogmatism. And a secular democracy is one which accepts secular insights, such as that the world is explicable in scientific terms. And certainly, even if it's not explicable entirely in scientific terms, you certainly don't need to haul God into it to explain matters. And so you have polarities and contrast: democracy against hierarchy, secular against religious, science against authority, reason against faith. Fourthly, the relation, therefore, of science to faith is perceived to be an example of the relation of reason to faith. Faith or religion is at best a matter of opinion, but at worst a damaging superstition. And that's what gives urgency to the debate on science, faith, and reason. If religious folks were simply intellectually stupid, that might not of itself be socially too damaging. After all, let us tolerate such folks. But actually, religion is a force for huge social destruction, and hence, amongst the new atheists, what you have is not simply argument on, say, science and faith, but on the socially damaging effects of religious belief. God talk and faith talk is socially damaging. All right, well, all that will be very familiar to all of you here, I guess. But that's, I hope, a fair account of the way popular perceptions often go. Now let's tell the story a little more carefully. Point 5. In other words, let's try to inject some historical accuracy into the picture of what goes on. Now I'm going to be very brief here. Firstly, 5a. Christianity, after all, when it was born into a philosophical world. By which I mean, of course, not that everyone were philosophers, but that there were powerful philosophical systems and beliefs abroad. And the question which Christian leaders had to face, of course, was the question of what then do you do? Christianity does not start as a philosophy. It is testimony to Jesus and response to Jesus. But where you're surrounded by philosophy, how do you respond to it? Now, there was, in the early Christian centuries, a spectrum of responses. You could have pretty negative attitudes towards philosophy. What has philosophical wisdom to do with the cross of Jesus Christ, through which God speaks to us and through which he heals us? No, philosophy knows nothing about that. Others could emphasize that actually you have to come to some sort of accommodation with philosophy. You have to show that Christianity has a dimension to it, or is explicable in terms that meet the requirements of a philosophical culture. In other words, Christianity can be given a certain kind of philosophical statement. You can show how it relates to philosophical wisdom. You can give it an conscious intellectual dimension, component. And that's what many of the church fathers did, one way or the other. There was a spectrum. B, in the Middle Ages, huge events occurred to steer the course taken between the relation of Christianity to philosophy. And there was a significant challenge to religious authority. I've mentioned here Islam, Aristotle, in the Middle Ages. It is really the thought of Aristotle which was the stimulus for a great deal in the developments of thinking about science and religion, or science and Christianity, from about the 13th to the 16th centuries. Aristotle's work, written in Greek, of course, was little known. Some of it was known in the West for quite a long time, up until the period of the Middle Ages, say the 13th century roughly, a little bit before that too, where it was injected into the stream of Western thought in a very significant way. Because Muslims were discovering the work of Aristotle, and it was running into conflict with certain of their beliefs. So what is a Muslim philosopher to do when, on the one hand, the Quran teaches that God created the world and that there is life after death, and on the other hand, Aristotle, by rigorous philosophical reasoning, comes to conclusions incompatible with that? And it was the Muslims who were largely responsible for translation of the work of Aristotle from Greek into Arabic, and that was translated into Latin. Syriac was another mediating language. Anyway, Aristotle comes to hit the West largely through the influence of Muslim thinkers who found themselves with a dilemma. And the dilemma was precisely the one I've stated. If your religious authority tells you one thing about reality and the world, including its creation, and rigorous analytic philosophical thought, working off the world we see around us and inferring things from that, tells you another, what are you to believe? Well, no good Muslim is going to say, well, of course, I believe Aristotle rather than the Quran. Can't do that. Literally, if you did, you'd do it in pain of life. But what you could say is that from a philosophical standpoint, the creation of the world and time is highly unlikely. But from the religious standpoint, it is true. And so the mind begins to operate with separate categories. Religion tells you this, philosophy tells you the other. And there are different modes of thought coming to different conclusions. Now, you could always say, of course, if it is true that God created the world, that just goes to show that there's something inadequate in philosophy. You could always say that. But come a day, perhaps, when you begin to say, well, actually, what those philosophers are saying ought to be taken fully seriously as any religious belief in my own mind and heart. Well, along came this gentleman, Thomas Aquinas. He got the whole world in his hands. Together now. Oh, I could talk about Thomas Aquinas, but I won't. Beyond saying this, Thomas, in the 13th century, Christian theologian and philosopher, was worried. He did not like this business of the way in which philosophy and theology, or philosophy and faith, were pulling in different directions. And Thomas came up with what is often known as the Thomistic synthesis. Roughly, and we're doing terrible violence here to a great deal of this material by not being subtle at all about it, but let's try to hit the main bases. Roughly speaking, what Thomas said is this: there are certain things which cannot be known philosophically and rationally. For example, God is Father, Son, and Spirit. God has redeemed the world through Jesus Christ. These are matters of faith. However, there are certain things which can be known by reason or by faith. I'm using the word know loosely there. I'll comment on it in a second. They can be known by reason or by faith. Philosophically, you can demonstrate the existence of God, at least the high probability of God's existence. And you can talk about certain attributes which the deity has and defend these in a rational philosophical way. That's different from what most people do. Most people go along to church and believe the church's teaching and the Bible and the fathers. So philosophical thinking and theological thinking are indeed different. Theology does have to do with faith, that's true. Philosophy has to do with reason, that's true. But as a matter of fact, philosophy can come to the same conclusion as faith. In fact, it does. When you think rigorously about the world, you'll conclude that God exists, or at least that it's highly probable. That's the same conclusion as religious believers have. So you have modes of thought which are different from each other, the philosophical and the religious, but they can converge on the conclusion that God exists. But that doesn't mean to say that philosophy swallows up theology or any such thing, because in faith there are certain things you know which philosophers can never know. Those are, let us say, roughly above reason, but they don't collide with reason. In fact, your philosophy supports your faith. Now, strictly speaking, faith is not knowledge for Aquinas. Technically speaking, it's not knowledge, but that doesn't mean to say it's something low. It's more than simply opinion. You can have the assurance of faith. It is simply that it doesn't proceed about its business of knowing things in a technical, rational fashion. That's why you don't call it knowledge, but it's not something less than knowledge in the sense that it's only a guess or opinion or something of that kind. But that is a fairly technical point, at least for our purposes, in Aquinas. Fourthly, 5D. The synthesis broke up. After Aquinas, people came along and said, we're not convinced this works. We're not convinced that this harmony of faith and reason, to call it that very broadly, we're not convinced this harmony is one which really does work. And there's a tendency in many circles to play down what it was that reason could demonstrate. A skepticism about the power of reason set in. This is one of many strands, but it's one of the strands that made for the breakup of the synthesis. So that there was an increasing bifurcation. On the one hand, you have authority and the church and faith. On the other hand, it's not so much that your reason cuts against those beliefs as that your reason's not competent at all in those areas. Reason can't tell you very much about the things of religion at all. And culturally, the significance of the synthesis breaking up intellectually, to the extent that it did, culturally the significance was that in the 16th century, Christendom itself, that unity of church and society which goes under the title Christendom, it itself began to break up in a very public way with the Protestant Reformation, or the Reformations, because there's more than one Reformation in Europe in the 16th century. culturally, therefore, it is of highest importance. And you have a deadly combination in the 16th century of 5E, science, skepticism, and the Protestant Reformation. I think we'll start with skepticism. When I retire from Union Theological College, if God gives me life a little longer, that is how I wish to be remembered. Fully clothed, however. Yeah, well, I'm concealing the big muscles. Modesty, you know. His muscles stood out like sparrows' kneecaps. You know. I could have used another image, obviously, but in the 16th century, what you had was a deadly combination, because just at the time when there was fierce argument between Protestants and Catholics, and amongst Protestants themselves as well, just at that time, you had the republication in Europe of texts from the ancient world, texts written by the skeptics, capital S. In ancient skepticism, there were different strands. Some skeptics said nothing can be known. Others said that is a piece of dogmatism, because if you say nothing can be known, you are claiming that one thing can be known, namely that nothing can be known. That is a skepticism which is not skeptical enough. We don't even know if anything can be known or not. Now, that might sound like the kind of thing which philosophers would love to discuss, and do discuss, and let them do it, you might say. But in the context of social Europe in the 16th century, it is pretty heady stuff to have the republication of these ancient texts. You see here Catholics saying, we know. And here Protestants saying, we know. And different groups of Protestants saying, we know. And perhaps the problem is, because they're coming into conflict in a bloody way, perhaps the problem is they don't really know. Perhaps they don't ask themselves, how can anyone know anything? But the skeptics did ask themselves that question. And it's not simply destructive force, because at the same time you have such interest in science. Modern science stirred, depends where you date it, but it stirred before the 16th century. Nevertheless, when in the 16th and then the 17th century, you have the serious proposal being made that maybe people have looked wrongly at the relation of the Earth to the Sun. Maybe all that's going to be challenged. When you get a lot of excitement in connection with the observations and the deductions made with that kind of question in mind, then suddenly you seem to have an alternative to this way of knowing things, because both the Bible and philosophy perhaps have to begin to give way before what can be demonstrated scientifically. Certainly the Bible has to give way before it if necessary. Now, for reasons we can go into if you like, we know there's no collision between the Bible and the perception that the Earth goes around the Sun, the heliocentric universe. The question rises, however, there may be no collision at that point, but should there be a collision between Scripture and science, who should you believe? And as I say, the new science, although I won't go into this, in certain ways undermine traditional philosophy as well, although it's substituted in its train new philosophical impulses which challenged received wisdom in theology. Now, you can see, therefore, how it is that faith and reason come to be seen in this kind of context, with the rise of science and modern science, with the skepticism which philosophers were taking interest in the 16th century, with the break of Europe. You can see how faith and reason came to be seen as alternatives which might be opponents. However, if you actually read the history of thought further on, you'll find that this business of the opposition between faith and reason is something which is the figment of imagination of many people who quite unashamedly popularize things they know deep down to be wrong. That is, they will continue to give the impression, some atheists will continue to give the impression that it's faith or reason we are talking about here, and that since the advent, at least, of the scientific revolution, it has been faith versus reason. Well, as a matter of fact, of course, if you actually scrutinize what thinkers, philosophers, theologians, and scientists were saying at the time, they were not seeing faith and scientific reason in opposition to each other. Let me pick out two thinkers here. One is Pascal, and the other is Locke. Now, in what follows, I'm not going to give you references because I believe still up on the Christians in Science Ireland website is a talk I gave on religion and scientific reason, Dawkins, Locke, and Pascal. Religion and scientific reason, Dawkins, Locke, and Pascal. You'll have the references to what I'm about to say on that web article. Let me say a few words about Pascal. Pascal, 1623, 1662, was a genius, mathematician, inventor, experimental scientist, not to mention religious thinker. After he'd built a calculating machine, he turned his attention to the experiments by Torricelli, the disciple of Galileo, to figure out how we are to interpret what looks like the empty space that appears when you fill a tube with mercury and suspend it upside down under certain conditions. Pascal was insistent that it was the senses and not some logical reason that was to resolve such issues to do with the vacuum. With regard to experimental science, Pascal was occupied with the question of the role of observation in the establishment and confirmation of scientific theory. There's a difference, Pascal thought, between the description of phenomena and the invocation of theoretical causes to explain phenomena. But where do we draw the line? How can causes be tested? Well, those questions accompanied Pascal's experiments on levels of mercury in the Torricelli tube to see whether we can draw conclusions about the existence of a vacuum. So here he is proceeding as a scientist. He's a religious believer proceeding as a scientist. He's also occupied with the question of how first principles in scientific and philosophical reasoning are ever known. How do you ever know the first principles which underlie scientific and philosophical reasoning? Geometry expresses the most exact form of reasoning, and its demonstrations are demonstrations par excellence, the paradigm of demonstration. But if we try to analyze some of the fundamental concepts which enter into geometry, or more broadly into experimental sciences, number, space, time, movement, we find ourselves unable to arrive at satisfactory and incontestable definitions. So we seem to do far better at definition and demonstration when it comes to the practice of geometry than when we scrutinize foundational concepts, like concepts of number or of space. Forgetting then faith and religion, I've said a word about that here, Pascal is interested in the actualities of scientific reasoning and experiment and observation, but he also asks fundamental questions about the theoretical foundations of these, and he finds these to be much, much harder to be able to grasp and analyze than the actualities of experiment. Now, Pascal has been labeled a fideist. You'll see the word there, 6a. And a fideist is someone who believes that you are entitled to hold your beliefs, in this case religious beliefs, without a rational foundation, that no one should compel you to give a rational foundation for religious beliefs, roughly fideism here. Pascal's been called that, and it is simply mistaken. If you read Pascal's work, you will find this is simply not the case in relation to Pascal. Pascal does believe, however, that if we give reason free rein, reason hits its own limits. Reason is self-limiting. I quote him here from the Pensées, Thoughts. One must know when it is right to doubt, to affirm, to submit. Anyone who does otherwise does not understand the force of reason. Reason, as Augustine said, would never submit unless it judged. This is not nasty religious people telling reason off. Reason would never submit unless it, reason, judged that there are occasions when it ought to submit. I quote him again, there is nothing so consistent with reason as this denial of reason. I quote him again, reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. It is merely feeble if it does not go so far as to realize that. Pascal actually, therefore, quite apart from arguing that reason limits itself, he actually does try to give reasons for Christian believing. He does a lot, for example, with Old Testament prophecies and their fulfillment in Jesus Christ. We might not find those compelling, excuse me, we might not find those compelling, but it's certainly what Pascal does. He tries to reason his way to certain conclusions. And he concludes about the relation of faith to reason like this. Faith certainly tells us what the senses do not. But faith doesn't tell us the contrary of what the senses say. Faith tells us what the senses do not. But faith doesn't tell us something to the contrary of what the senses say. Faith is above and not against the senses. Further, Pascal thought that scientific and religious knowledge don't operate in quite the same way. Where scientific reason is concerned, the will does not enter into things very much. What do I mean? Well, at a preliminary stage, if you're investigating something in science where you are being motivated a certain way, the will can be involved. I can decide that I want or do not want to find out whether there is a vacuum. And I can will to start experimenting. But once my will is established, so I've wanted to start experimenting and I'm doing it, once that's settled, it's up to understanding to operate. I can't then determine conclusions. Once I've said I wanted to find out about the vacuum, then the will recedes off stage. Right, from that then on, it's simply a reason and understanding that figures out what the vacuum, whether there is a vacuum. Science proceeds on the intellectual basis of truths that Pascal calls natural and known to everyone. But religion works in a different domain because the will is involved in religion in the way it's not in science. The heart has a different order from the mind. The heart, says Pascal, has certain things that are of interest to it, such as the nature of human greatness or smallness, humility, pride, love. Here, the will is involved. It has its own first principles, the heart does, such as the desire to be happy. The will's desire to be happy has no role to play in scientific work. But Christian faith addresses itself to that dimension of the human person. So religious faith involves acts of the will, including desires and active commitments, that indicate that we're operating in a different domain from science. Pascal concludes, the way of God who disposes all things with gentleness is to instill religion into our minds with reasoned arguments and into our hearts with grace. Now let me move on quickly because I really want to give time to points 11 and 13. Let me move on quickly to Locke and the 6b. Locke was called the intellectual ruler of the 18th century. That's what he was called by Virginia Woolf's father, Sir Leslie Stephen. And I'll be much briefer on Locke than on Pascal. Like Pascal, although they were often thought of as very different thinkers, and they are in certain respects, but there are certain similarities. Like Pascal, what Locke says is something like this. Let reason go as far as it wants. Don't prohibit it. Don't ban it in the name of faith or religion. Let reason think what it wants. It simply won't get very far. Reason itself soon hits its own limits, says Locke. Like Pascal, he makes distinctions, although in a slightly different way as well, between matters that are against reason and above reason. There are certain truths according to reason. 2 times 2 equals 4. That's according to reason, and no amount of faith can undermine it. There are certain things that are contrary to reason. 2 times 2 equals 5. No amount of faith can establish that. Certain things which reason cannot decide on. The dead shall be raised. How can reason figure that out? Can't. It's a truth, if it is a truth at all, above reason. So how then might you set about establishing the truth of that? Well, as far as Locke is concerned, if you're going to say something like the dead shall be raised, and it's the kind of thing which reason cannot of itself either prove or disprove as a matter of fact, as a proposition, then you have to ask what evidence might there be for such a proposition. You know, has anyone ever seen a dead person walking? I mean, could there be testimony? And Locke says, well, actually there was. There was testimony in the Bible to this. And reason, therefore, looks at the testimony and says, well, as a matter of fact, this is reason. I myself can't figure all these things out, but there were people who we think, we have good reason to believe, saw these things. And therefore, it becomes rational to believe in that which is above reason, because there is testimony to the fact that at least one person rose from the dead. Now, my point is that when we are told, that in the tradition of Christian thought, there has been this sort of pursuit of faith rather than reason, and science is on the side of reason. Read Locke and Pascal in the 17th century, two massive thinkers. 17th century, not primitives in the 2nd century. You have distinction between faith and reason and science and religion. Distinctions, yes, of certain kinds, but not tensions, not oppositions at all. And both of them thought very, very rigorously whether or not they were right. Whether or not they were right we'll come to briefly at the end. What are we to say on science, faith, and reason then? A quick word about science, point 7. Although in philosophy of science, much has been said for a long time now about the way in which people misunderstand science. People think that science is a matter of observing and demonstrating, full stop. Although in philosophy of science it's been said that that is just a simplistic way of looking at things, that there are shifts in paradigms, patterns, ways of viewing the world, that science actually, in order to operate properly as science, relies on the possibility of falsification. You've got to be able to falsify things. Although that is all the case, in other words, although there are sophisticated philosophies of science which have been around for some time, which tell us that science is not simply observing and demonstrating, though there are philosophical issues around that, nevertheless, I think that we have to be careful what we do with that. Let philosophers of science debate it. We certainly should not, and this point was made last night in discussion, we certainly should not simply let scientists, as it were, I speak as a non-scientist, get away with saying science shows or science proves X, Y, Z. On the other hand, there's no need, is there? You scientists and philosophers of science tell me, there's no need for total skepticism. Well, you can't find out anything in science in that case. So let's assume that science can deliver certain high probabilities of truth. Let's assume that, even though there can be a lot of naivety and unsophistication around the discussion of what science can and cannot do. Let me then, point 8, say a word about reason, which is simply going through the terms here. Within secular philosophy, the notion of rational neutrality has long been challenged. Some of the great atheistic thinkers of the 19th century thought that, as a matter of fact, reason and thought is driven by motives and interests. It's not, people don't think in a rationally neutral way. That comes from the mouths of non-Christians. And it's especially the case in religion, is it not? We have interests here. It matters whether or not God exists. It should matter whether or not God exists. Well, we're not going to be rationally dispassionate in our examination of that. So let's allow that there is a myth to this talk of rational neutrality, at least to a large extent. But let's not again be totally subversive. Let us allow also that there are certain things which we might broadly speak of as rational or reasonable in principle. Though I think Locke and Pascal show that if you do that in principle, if you allow reason to be regarded as a neutral instrument, let it be to some extent, still you'll soon hit the limits. A word about faith. This came up in discussion last night. I am opposed to the word religion. I find almost useless discussions of religious versus secular culture and so forth. Religion comprises Zen Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, different modes of Hinduism, and there can be vast, vast differences between them. In fact, I think the concept of religion is an imposition, probably going back to the 16th and 17th century, an imposition on a vast range of views, which we roughly, broadly call religion. We ought, if we I think, we ought to try to subvert that talk as soon as people get into it. Religious versus secular. What do you mean by religious? I've been told you're a religious person, aren't you? Do you know, I have no idea if I'm religious. I have no idea. I believe with all my heart in Jesus Christ, but I have no idea if I'm religious, because I think by religious they mean the kind of person who's temperamentally religious, who kind of, inclines that way. It's in his or her genes. I don't know if I'm like that. I think I'm a skeptic. But a believing skeptic. I don't know. But anyway, the word religion is a nuisance of a word here, and when I talk about faith, I shall mean here Christian faith, while allowing, of course, that we can talk about faith in other contexts. 10. How do Christians ever come to believe what they do believe? (10a). In restricting myself to Christians is because I don't think we can talk about religion generally. I'm not trying to exclude from the debate non-Christian religious thought. Get me right there. Well, how did Christians come to believe what they do believe? Well, firstly, 10a, the knowledge of God in the Old Testament seems to have come to the people of Israel, according to their record, by word and event. People heard God speak, whatever that was like, and they saw things happen, according to the record. And the two things are interlocked. If people said, well, God said X, Y, Z to Abraham, and nothing ever happened, then maybe people stop saying that God said anything. If, on the other hand, funny things started happening, like the waters of the Red Sea parting, but there's no interpretation of it, you'd say, well, the odd things happen, but you don't know why. Word and event fit together. Events happening back up the claim that God spoke in the first place. God speaking interprets the events that have happened. That's the way it goes in the Hebrew Scriptures, in their testimony. B, when it comes to the New Testament, there is a focus, of course, on how Christ is known. And what I want to indicate here is that we have, in a way, highly rational, in its way, basis set out for us. This is how Luke begins his Gospel. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, my italics, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Put it another way, a little imaginatively, Theophilus, I don't want you to have blind faith. You've been taught certain things. But Luke is saying, Dawkins is quite right. Good old Richard, says Luke. He's quite right. Blind faith is wrong. That's why I'm writing this gospel, my friend Theophilus. I don't want you simply to believe things because you've been taught them. I've investigated them myself, and here are the results of my investigation. Now, you and I, at a distance of time like this, cannot track Luke's investigations and investigate for ourselves his investigation. How can we 2,000 years on? But that's not his fault. The point is that at its time, the biblical writers were trying to present the public face of faith. You have the same thing with Paul writing to the Corinthians in the 15th chapter about the resurrection. He talks about eyewitnesses. Go and talk to them, he says. Some have died, but some are still alive. Again, you and I can't access that directly. What's significant was that in its time, the early Christian witness sought to give an empirical grounding for faith. That's what it did. So, 10c, the structure of theological epistemology. If we ask ourselves how faith and reason work in the Scriptures very broadly, well, reason, we might say, if we want to use that word, has a kind of place. There is a wisdom which is available to thinking people, and that's expressed in the books of wisdom in the Old Testament. It's certainly reasonable to accept eyewitness testimony. We have to ask why, of course, we should accept the testimony of the Bible, but what's interesting and significant for our purposes at the moment is that they themselves sought to present what they believed on the basis of eyewitness testimony. And we mustn't be misled here by the statement of John's Gospel, sometimes quoted, blessed are those who believe and have not seen. Because what Jesus meant was not that eyewitnesses are unimportant. He didn't mean that. What he meant was that obviously only one generation or two generations would have eyewitness experience. Others wouldn't. Faith, therefore, matters to the others as something built on their testimony, eyewitness testimony, not instead of anything empirical. And you know, the one disciple of whom Dawkins speaks positively is Thomas, doubting Thomas. But was Thomas all that rational to doubt? I mean, Thomas believed in God. And 10 other disciples said they'd seen Jesus. Now, why should Thomas believe his own skepticism more than 10 people who presumably weren't having a great laugh and joke at his expense? In any case, the 10 disciples were perfectly reasonable in believing, weren't they? Because they had seen. They were trusting their senses. Now we can ask why it is anyone should believe the Bible today, but my point is a more limited one at the moment there. Now, to say I want to spend a little time, I think I have an hour and all, isn't that, yes, Rodney? So I've about 10 minutes left or so. 12, 14 and 15 will be just 1 minute each. So 11 and 13 I want to give some time to. Let's crack on. Point 11. In a scientific culture, as ours is often judged to be, the question of natural theology arises. Do Christians have a stake in trying to back up their faith with observation about the world which isn't to do with testimony of the Christian scriptures or history or Jesus Christ? Now, I want to say 4 things here. Firstly, 11a, there is a distinction which is constantly overlooked. There's a distinction between natural knowledge of God and natural theology. If I say God can be known naturally or without special revelation, I'm simply saying that. A natural theology is a whole system of thought by which you argue from certain data to certain conclusions. A theology is an elaborate, structural, argumentative business. A claim that God is known is something much more modest than that. 11b, we need to apply that distinction. The Apostle Paul, in Romans chapter 1, says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. But Paul is not saying there, he's not necessarily denying, but he's not saying there that you can start with the world as a causal system, or whatever it is, and infer from all that there must be a first cause who started it all off. He's not saying that. He's not thinking of logical inferences. That would be natural theology. He's talking about intuitive associations. That is, that when people see the world around them, there is in their minds, and we could, of course, debate what he means and whether this is true, but there is in their minds an intuitive association of God. They perceive God through the created order in that way. So Paul is not actually sanctioning natural theology here, although he's not denying it either. He's simply saying there is a connection between knowledge of God and knowledge of the world. C. Paul actually assumes a connection of moral and cosmic awareness. As far as Paul is concerned, that mind or heart which sees a connection between the world outside and God is also a heart or mind that has certain moral convictions. He doesn't simply argue about God as creator of the world, an intelligent designer or first cause, something of that kind. He doesn't do that only. It has a moral awareness. There is at the heart of our knowledge of God for Paul a moral component, one way or the other. Certain things are true and untrue, right and wrong in the moral dimension of life, and that applies therefore when we come to know God. There is knowledge of right and wrong bound up with our knowledge that God exists. Now, of course, it's controversial in our day, and we could go over that, but my point is at the moment that Paul himself is not directly sanctioning a natural theology. That's my only point right here. D, There is a potential and a limit to natural theology in the light of scientific cosmogony. Cosmogony is not a misspelling instead of cosmology. Cosmogony has to do with the origins of the world. Cosmology is talk about the world. Cosmogony is about the actual birth or origin of the world. At one stage, some scientists maintained that you need not say that the world had a beginning in time. There might have been a state which persisted one way or the other, always has persisted. I'm told now, and saying this in somebody else's authority, because of course I wouldn't know directly, so tell me if I got this wrong, but I'm told now that no astrophysicist actually holds that. That, as a matter of fact, astrophysicists hold that the world has a beginning in or with time. Now, consider this argument. Everything that comes into existence must have a cause. The universe came into existence. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. That is, in formal logic, a perfectly valid argument. You can question the premises, but you can't question the reasoning. That was an argument deployed in the Middle Ages to demonstrate the existence of God. I think that it's a natural theological argument which has some force to it. That is to say, it forces atheism to the confession that atheism is a faith, which it is, because an atheist has to maintain logically, if the atheist maintains that the world has beginning in time, that the world existed without a cause. Terry Pratchett, in the beginning there was nothing and then it exploded. He said humorously, this point. Now, an atheist may say, well, maybe that's the way it is. And most atheists will say, I'm not interested in those things. These are mysteries and beyond us. Yes, there may be mysteries and beyond us in many ways. But an atheist who is a dogmatic atheist is committed to the belief that actually the world came into existence without any cause at all. Now, how is that more rational, some of us will say, than believing in a cause, a creator God? It is a line, I think, worth pushing, at least to show the logic of atheism and to show that Christians actually think in ways which can be given that kind of logical form. On the other hand, I myself don't want to push those much too hard, because the arguments can very easily become arguments about a very remote kind of deity. It's not the Christian God you feel you're talking about after a while. I've been involved in discussions with atheists where I get the feeling we're talking about whether a planet exists. God has been treated like an object, like a planet, like that. Also, there are logical, philosophical questions surrounding the kind of inferences you make when you're talking at that level. So I'm cautious about pushing a natural theological line too hard while accepting that it has some use. Let me leave it generally there for a moment. Now, point 12, there are perplexities in connection with faith and science, which I was only going to deal with briefly, to say a brief word, and I think I'll omit that for the moment. My apologies to you, Alan. I said I'd pick up on this morning. Put it to me as a question either in public session tonight. I think we have a public session tonight, if you would. The reason I wasn't never going to deal with it for long was that Dennis Alexander can speak about creation and evolution later, so let me just leave that altogether. A brief word about providence, causality, and the significance of feathered friends. Observe the birds. Your Heavenly Father feeds them. Question. Did Jesus observe his Heavenly Father feeding them? Think about that. I'll omit that too. I want to move on to perplexities in connection with faith and science, which is the last point I want to make. The concluding observations. Concluding observation 15 I can leave altogether, I think. I'll just say one word about. And 14 can be very brief. A. What is involved in the claim that Jesus rose from the dead? No one has a concept of the resurrection. The resurrection itself was never ever seen by anyone. No one has a concept of it. What they saw was the risen Jesus in the empty tomb. No one in the New Testament has a concept of the risen body of Jesus. They observe and describe and testify, but they do not have a conception of it in terms of, well, this is how his body must have been or worked. We don't have any of that. What is involved in the claim that Jesus rose from the dead is that there's a miracle and there's a possibility of life after death. Now, for many people, the main collision point between faith and science is miracle. Can I have up to 5 minutes? 'Cause I think I started 5 minutes late. Is that right? No more than 5 minutes. For many people, the collision between faith and science comes to the point of miracle. And questions can be asked about how you define miracle. Is a miracle an event which is against the law of nature? Is a miracle an event which is according to the law of nature? Or are there such things as laws of nature anyway? Imagine this person who in the first century has written this hot-shot PhD thesis on water. And this person has picked up all the possible properties of water and listed them in a first century doctorate, which is brilliant. And to celebrate, just the day before submission, he goes to the wedding of a friend in Cana in Galilee. What happens? The water becomes wine, and this perplexes him. He's really got to get this PhD. So he adds a footnote to the text. P.S. Water also has a property of becoming wine. Mm-hmm. Now, his director of studies says, there's something wrong here. You can't do that. But I saw it, and this is supposed to be an exhaustive essay on water. Well, what would you conclude? Well, you'd say it's not property of water exactly that it can become wine. It's certainly not in the power of water to become wine, but maybe we could say water has a capacity to become wine. Maybe we could say that. But what we mean is that it has the capacity to become wine when touched on by a power from without. In other words, a claim to a miracle which is not conceptualized in the New Testament, simply described, it's this PhD guy who's trying to conceptualize stuff. What we can say perhaps is that God has set up the world in such a way that the things in it have their properties. We might even talk about them having their powers and their capacities. But it's such that when touched by God himself, something is done, an operation upon, or perhaps in some cases, an activation from within. It can be conceived in different ways. This material element, which means that miracles can happen. Belief in miracles really is not contra-scientific at all. It's simply belief in the existence of God, and the existence of God who is capable of operating. There should really be no scientific difficulties with miracles at all, if you believe in God. Conceptualize in different ways if you want. Life after death, is that a scientific problem? Many of you, I guess, or some of you will be familiar with John Polkinghorne's remarks on this. When Polkinghorne says he doesn't think there is such a problem with it after all, think of our present bodies as a kind of hardware and of our personalities as a kind of software, and that in the next life this software is transferred to another hardware. He says, as a scientist, says John Polkinghorne, who I believe knows something about science, does he not? I don't have a problem with that, he says. The Christian belief is in the resurrection of the body, but the resurrection of the body does not mean the resurrection of this body that you see before you, although it's popularly thought of as such. But Paul fights hard against that. In 1 Corinthians 15:35 onwards, read that passage sometime, if you're not familiar with it. Paul says, someone says, with what kind of bodies will they come? It's a skeptic who says, how can anyone be raised from the dead? And Paul says, you foolish man, what comes to life eventually does not come to life until it dies. What you sow is not the body that you have now. What you sow is a seed, or whatever it is, and God will give it later a body. You do not sow the resurrection body from this body. This body only provides some sort of seed. No proper analogy for it. God gives it as bodies as he's chosen. Christians do not believe in the reassembly of, or should not believe in the reassembly of the material constituents of our present fleshly body. We have soma in Greek, body in the future, not sarx, flesh. Body is a wider concept in Paul there. And again, it has to do with belief in God. If there is God, there should be no scientific problems with these things. So much hinges on something very, very basic here. So I conclude. Were Pascal and Locke right? Well, they had the differences, which I didn't actually discuss. And I think that they were wrong if they thought of reason as a neutral instrument. If they thought of that straightforwardly, and Locke, I think, did, I think there's a mistake there. But I think their instincts were similar in certain respects and were correct. that even if you give reason its place, it will not go very far before having to haul in something which is not pure reason. And I think they were right in plotting faith in relation to reason, not as an antithesis, but as a contrast. So, science, faith, and reason today. Well, many people around us see the dangers in science, note the disagreement between scientists. I think one of the big things we have to do, and I'll cryptically conclude on that, is to try to get very clear on the distinction between scientific statements and metaphysical statements, which are inferences. I keep hearing about science saying X, Y, Z, and I say to myself, that's not strictly scientific. That is an inference somewhere along the line. That's a point which I would make with my philosophical hat on, not with my religious hat on, which I've worn for a little too long, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's got us off to a cracking start for today, and we've got some time now for questions, so over to you. Actually, I'm interested, just to mention, that the examination for the fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford, used to have these they just abolished it, and used to have these one-word sort of topics, and one was water in recent years.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Sadly, they've abolished it. Most difficult exam in the world, right under water for 3 hours. But anyway.
Don't anyone try anything with my water, by the way. I'm happy with it as it is.
Yeah.
Section 2 there, you were saying about, are we not in postmodern times? And I know what you're saying, that a lot of the rhetoric does still seem to be fitting very much within the boundaries of modernity. I mean, Dawkins, for example, sounds disturbingly modern and old-fashioned in that kind of sense, if you can use those two words like that. How would this talk be different, and how would the whole thing be different if and when postmodernity really does catch on in these positions?
Thank you. Well, it would be different in that you would not need to square faith with reason, because there'd be no such thing as reason. There are reasons, a postmodern might say, an authentic postmodern, but not reason, capital R. So I wouldn't even have to strike an apologetic note in that respect, because in postmodernity, speaking broadly, a dogmatic religious authority has been removed by reason, but they've also removed the dogmatic authority of reason. Also, and here others can speak more competently than I, one would talk about science in different terms, because I've been talking about science in a very, very traditional way. I made the gesture in the direction of paradigms and so forth earlier, but I don't know much about postmodern science. I've read a little bit about it, of course, but you would not treat science in the Dawkins fashion here, as you say, it is modern, so that you would then, I think, William, be asking afresh there what it is, what are the points of conflict in principle between Christian faith and whatever it is that postmoderns do want to say about science. And there might be very little, actually, formal conflict there. So I think one probably would talk far more in the postmodern context about things like aspirations, desires, qualities, the way in which body and mind are merged, body, mind, and heart are merged, and how Christian faith addresses these in a holistic kind of way, rather than the sort of fragmented way of going about things. That may be too cryptic to be helpful, my response.
Thank you. Yes, that's an important question. Yeah.
How is it possible to critique the idea of rational neutrality if it does not exist? And if we kind of acknowledge that it exists to some extent, it will be a more balanced view on the postmodern critique.
Well, you can critique things that don't exist if they exist as concepts. If there's a concept of rational neutrality, then you can ask whether that concept is one which is justifiable.
Yeah. How do you find the reasons to critique
In other words, how can your critique of rational neutrality be objective if there's no such thing?
Rational.
Yeah. Well, you're not pretending to. You're saying, really, if you like, you're saying my critique of rational neutrality is not an entire rationally neutral critique, because no such critique is possible. So you can, in one blow, deny rational neutrality and deny of yourself that you are being rational neutral in critiquing it. That's true. But I think here we've got to begin to cut this up a little bit. So that you might say, look, let's look at the way in which reason actually operates. Let's look at the way in which it is motivated. I am motivated as you are. I have interests as you have. Let's bring these out on the table. Let's talk about them. Let's talk about what drives you in your reasoning, what drives me in my reasoning. Further, I'm not completely divorced from the idea of rational neutrality, I confess. I do think, and here I am criticized sometimes as being an old-fashioned empiricist under the influence of Locke, I do think that there's still something about the testimony of the senses which, even if you can't call it a matter of rational neutrality, has a kind of objectivity to it which we can rationally discuss. So I have something of the old-fashioned empiricist in me there.
Yeah.
I would like to make a comment and ask a question.
Yeah.
The comment is that when you told about the beginning of the universe
Yes.
as the beginning of everything, that is not the ultimate picture that we have today. I mean, science has been bending over backwards to find out what happened before, which only means putting the moment zero back in time.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And therefore it's not a real solution.
Yeah.
But there are theories of quantum fluctuation spectrum and so forth that try to deal with the question.
Yes.
Okay. Now the question I have is, when you said that in the 18th century, in the 19th century, the Bible had to recede in the face of the march on of science, wouldn't it have been more accurate to say that a wrong concept of the Bible, a wrong reading of the Bible would have to recede? Because for the Christian, God is the author of nature, the creator of nature, and the author of the Bible, and therefore there must be some harmony between the two. And if one feels that the Bible is receding, it's probably the wrong concept of the Bible that does so.
Thank you. I'll comment first on your observation. First observation, I quite agree with it. I was using the word universe loosely. Whatever is pre-universe still has to be accounted for causally. So, yes, I accept all that, of course. When I talked about the Bible receding before science, let me make a couple of observations. Firstly, I do entirely agree with you. I didn't actually mean that with my own position. I was talking about the way in which it is perceived that the science Bible is receding. But as a matter of historical fact, this has been confirmed, well, it will be confirmed in greater detail, but reference it has been made in a recent work by Stephen Gokroja, if that's the correct pronunciation. He's writing a 5-volume study of scientific culture. It's going to be a magnificent work. The 4th volume I've read, I don't know if the 2nd volume's out yet. And one of the observations he makes is, he takes it as for granted that when in the 19th century, the Bible, people began to lose their belief in the Bible, it wasn't usually because of science. Science wasn't the problem. It was interpretations of the Bible and the book of Genesis and history. Those were the things that really upset people more than so-called scientific, that is, natural scientific advances. But I agree with you. I'm glad, if I give the impression that I thought myself the Bible was wrong and fleeing before science, I'm glad to correct that publicly. Thank you.
Yes.
What extent, if any, does intuition provide a partial clue how faith works?
You know, it used to be said in relation to intuition that when philosophers hear the word intuition, they reach for their analytic guns, and that intuition is a sign that argument has run out of steam. It's a huge issue. To what extent? Whether or not you call it intuition, I think to a considerable extent. I think actually there are certain basic intellectual and moral choices or religious choices that people make which are irreducible to a certain kind of argument in their favour. But that is life. It's not a weakness, it's life. Pascal was very, very good in this with his wager. I mean, the fact is, I'm standing on the platform in Connolly. There's a train going from Dublin to Belfast. In terms of my reasoning, I don't know whether I should take that train or not. There are arguments that stack up both ways. 50% in favour of staying in Dublin, 50% in favour of going to Belfast. 100% in favour of going to Wales, that's where I'm going. But I'm sticking to Dublin, Belfast. Now, nevertheless, I've got to decide. I've got either to step on that train or stay off it. And there's an entire commitment. Once I'm on the train, I'm on it. Once I'm off it, I'm off it. So what is it, therefore, that has forced my decision? It may be perfectly random and so forth, but it may be some sort of intuition that something tells me, as it were, that this would be the right thing to do. I can't formalize it, and I can't argue that. I think that intuition has an important role, but I would emphasize in the Christian faith the objectivity of eyewitnesses. This is what biblical writers put their emphasis on. Now, that doesn't take you all the way to faith in Jesus Christ. Somewhere along the line, something other than logic comes into it. And if you want to call it intuition, I suppose you could call it that. It's not the word I'd use, but I would live with it for certain purposes. Is that responding, or am I missing your point?
I'm not saying the two of them are the same.
Yeah.
Simply the mechanics of how they work. The different intuition, I would say that movie, Early Beckridge.
Yeah.
Not there. It was, can anyone remember who was the Rocky.
Yes.
Who was the actress in that? Julia Roberts. I mean, the woman who did the act was a woman in California who, by intuition, knew that the pharmaceutical people, were just up to very poisonous practices. She just stayed with the intuition, and later she got the proof.
Yes.
Now, she has spoken subsequently a little bit of the role of intuition, and I just wonder, and one of the things she said is it's disparaged, but it's particularly disparaged in the relationship between men and women, because overall women are better at it, and it drives men crazy. But the trouble is, so to speak, very often they're right. And, I just, if something is happening there, it's a real way of knowing, which can be falsified subsequently, or which can be verified subsequently. And I wonder whether, to some extent, it provides some sort of analogy for the way in which they work.
Well, I'd be interested, actually, if women would contribute to this. There are a few here, but let me just say that I think that I'm very hospitable to a feminist critique of everything I've done, because I think that women think with the body in ways which men don't, or are not aware of doing sometimes. There's an integration or awareness of integration many women have, so that intuition is not rational or body. Body and mind are deeply integrated. And I think that there can be holistic ways of thinking by women about all the problems of life, including this one, which are healthier and actually more biblical than male tendencies to compartmentalize, say, faith and reason, intuition and demonstration, those things. That's not a satisfactory answer. I don't think that intuition can be given any stable account very easily of. I mean, there are lots of kinds of intuition. I think we'd have to cut this up into a lot of different components. But I welcome the introduction of the word here. Yes, it needs to be thought about more. Do women present want to comment on this particular point or not? Actually, I think there are just 4. Am I right? looking very quickly at 5 and 5 or 6.
Well, I'd like to comment, not as a woman, but in view of the previous discussion and the previous question. Do you think, Stephen, that we put too much emphasis on the word reason and intuition and so on, and should think laterally in terms of our heart and mind and so on? It's all encompassed in the brain's function. And should we think more in terms of holistically of the brain functioning and whatever? I come to the point that the division of, in the terms of reason and intuition and so on, those are against the whole of neuroscience. And basically, we have got to get terms which are more holistic.
Yes. I'd say I think three things to that. Firstly, to a large extent, and maybe I need to think about this, to a large extent I was deliberately orienting this kind of presentation to what I take to be popular perceptions and attitudes.
Yes.
It still is the case that people seem to think in this reason and faith sort of way. Secondly, I think what you say about holism is important and significant, and maybe it's what I should have said in response to you earlier, William, that if one were looking at postmodern attitudes, not that you were taking it up from the postmodern standpoint, but one might think much more in integrative terms. Thirdly, though, even, I mean, you're the neuroscientist, I'm not, of course, but even the neuroscience, from what I've seen, and the way in which certain neuroscientists talk about faith and religion, even there, the old rationalist paradigm can work at a different level, deeper level, so that once you have found out how the brain functions, then you're in a position to state something about neuroscience and religion. But that, once you find out how the brain functions, is still working in some respects with an old rational paradigm, I think, interestingly. And of course, independently important issues come up about the relation of brain to mind. Are they identical? Or is mind something other than the physical organism of the brain? But yeah, I think it's a most promising line. Yes, I think we should follow it much more with intuition. I think, did you not? All right, you had your hand up earlier. Yes. Sorry.
I'll just say, sometimes what women may say is intuition is actually their observation, but it's happened so quickly that they're not registering, like it could be a flash in someone's face, or, do you know what I mean? That we're saying it's intuition as if there's some sixth sense, but it is often based on the five senses. It's happening very quickly that we can see, perhaps.
Yes, I think epistemology has a lot to do with the way the body works. And men and women's bodies, generally speaking, I know all issues surrounding this. I'm not trying to be naive about it, but men and women's bodies function differently. And that, I think, means you could revise the way in which the debate about faith and reason has gone on to a large extent. I know that's not the point you're making, but I want to put it on back of what you're saying. And I know I'm open to charges there of all kinds of things, and I won't go into it.
I think in the area that I'm working with ethics, there's been a real revival of the interest of the role of emotions in ethics.
Yes.
And I think this is part of the realization that rationality has its limits. And so there's a lot of interest in looking at what do we do with these emotional reactions, which a strand of rationalist philosophy would have said you keep them out of there, you get rid of those, and you come up with your rational arguments. But there's a lot of issues that have been coming up more recently where people are acknowledging that we have an emotional reaction to something that I cannot give you a rational argument for, and yet I believe very firmly this is right or this is wrong. One of those has been torture, where, and I think the other one is the question of vulnerability. Can we show that there's a really good rational reason to take care of the weak and the vulnerable? Or can we show that there's a good reason to believe that torture is wrong? And rationality has hit its limits in some of those areas, and people are saying, well, this is where your emotional reaction, your, I suppose, technically intuition, but also the bodily reaction to those sorts of scenes and issues is a vital part of the, I suppose, the holistic examination of that kind of an ethical issue.
I grant that, but would you not agree, Donald, that it doesn't at the moment help the cause of religion particularly, because people still think, all right, there are certain moral intuitions, we don't know how to account for those, about torture and so forth. We should hold those, and the matters of human rights and all those things, we don't quite know their basis, but we do hold them. But it's still a case that religion is on the margins. It is a possible option for some people, but it doesn't enhance, as it were, the cause of religion as such, a word about which I don't like to talk, as you know.
Possibly not, except that I think when the emotional component is in the Bible as well, and it's in that approach is, I think, more in keeping with the biblical perspective, a holistic approach, as opposed to a purely rational approach to issues and questions. So I think that's how I look at it rather than actually supporting.
Yes. I agree to a large extent, and yet I suppose I come back to the question of eyewitness testimony and the kind of solidity and objectivity of that. And I want to subordinate talk about men, women, intuition, holism, all faith reason, all those, to this kind of core testimony in the scriptures. So, but I grant your point. I think that either Francis or David had a hand up, probably.
I'm trying to figure out what kind of classic modernist you are as opposed to what kind of classic postmodernist you are. And it goes around a question like this. Can I be rational in believing a false proposition? Now, a modernist would be inclined to say, well, of course not, because you've violated some transcendental notion of the rational in coming to a sort of conclusion. Now, the postmodernist might be inclined to say something like this, that we should historicize rationality such that Ptolemy might be entirely rational to believe in the geocentric system in the ancient world, but you wouldn't be after, as Aaron said, 1543 or maybe even 1633 or whatever it might be. So one route is to say that rationality is inevitably historicized. What passes as a good reason for believing a proposition is inevitably going to change from time to time and from place to place. Whereas a modernist would be inclined to say he was just wrong and therefore he was not acting according to the canons of rationality. Now, where do you stand in this debate?
Yeah. I don't stand squarely on either side, but I want to make a concession to modernity here. And my very use of the word concession indicates, of course, I'm not fully within the camp. Firstly, I think, David, even within, I would myself say, even within modernity, you are rational in believing a false proposition if you have reason to believe it. So if you introduce me to the person with you and say, this is my wife, I have no reason to disbelieve it. And yet, actually, I might have every reason to believe it, and it might turn out to be false. Maybe someone else, you may be joking, something of that kind. So it might be rational to believe you, even when it's a false proposition. But the sympathy I have with modernity, the element I do not want to historicize, I want to historicize a lot, so I'm with you there, and I know I might sound here like a record that's playing all the time, and I did see you, peripheral vision, look at your watch at that moment. I do think there's something about eyewitness testimony which cannot be historicized easily. I think that it is the case, in any paradigm or any culture, as it were, that we were not in this room. There were or were not 50, 60 people there in this room. I think there's a kind of stubborn non-resistance there, which modernity has, and I would go along with it.
I think that Christianity and science ought to be united about that there's objective truth out there, and and opposed to postmodernism, which denies it. Would you not sort of say that?
As you formulate it like that, yes, I would. But I think one could do that and still take on board a lot of the criticism of modernity which postmoderns have offered. But I'm with you.
Well, it's about 10 seconds before coffee, so I think okay, one very last one, just quick. Yeah.
One last question, just not so much a question as a comment. You mentioned rationality. You mentioned conscience. Sorry, you mentioned everything except conscience. You mentioned morality. You mentioned altruism. You've not mentioned conscience. Where's that made?
Well, you said 10 seconds and you said a comment, which means...
I think it was coming in, wasn't it, when you were talking about moral awareness?
Yes, you're right, I did not talk about conscience. I think one could have explored that in relation to Paul and Romans chapter 1 and the evidence he presents there. So there was an implicit reference there on my part when referring to morality. You're right. You're quite right, I didn't talk about conscience in this context. Limits of time more than anything.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's been a brilliant talk. And as I say, we will be having questions for the panel this evening. If you write them down, and hopefully Claire will collect them if you can, or provide a box or something if you can for them at some point. but get your questions down for the speakers during the day. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
With the box, I brought a box
Oh,
down,
brilliant.
but obviously the cleaners took it away.
Oh, no.
I will find another one.
Oh, that's hilarious. That's hilarious. Well, let's give Stephen a round.
Thank you very much.